Utica, which is awesome. A lot of people have asked that over the last few years. So we do have a subcommittee now that will now be helping put events on in South Utica. So before we start, I want to introduce Mike and Anessa, who are, you guys can stand up. Both will be taking over the meetings and facilitating in June. So they'll be handling the newsletters, they'll be handling social media, they'll be keeping it the way we've had it for the last 4 years. So they will be who you'll come to when you want to ask questions. So thank you. So today we have Don from the St. Elizabeth's Hospital Steering Committee here, and he is going to go over what has happened so far and what to expect coming up on March 20th. So I'm just going to go right into it so that he can talk to you guys about that, okay?
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Hi, Brian.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Basically, I'm Don McGrath. I own a home on 13 Valentine Bray. I'm also an officer of the Citizens to Preserve Our Neighborhood, which basically that organization is the grantee of the conservation easement. The donor, of course, is St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And of course, the settlement agreement and the conservation easement agreement are important in regard to the reuse of the medical center, the campus. So there's been 2 public meetings, and a lot of you have attended those public meetings. And there's been 2 steering committee meetings. Various people are on the steering committee. And we, of course, give our suggestions as far as what we feel the reuse of that property should be. The draft generic environmental impact study, that was, I'm going to use the word completed by the planning board, but it's not a full complete because the public has 60 days to make a public comment in regard to that generic environmental impact study. And there's also a public meeting on March 20th where anyone can attend at City Hall at 4:30, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, on those times, where you can actually comment on the generic environmental impact study. So the study itself is on the City Utica website, and you'll see it on the front page or the home page. And the study is contained within 1,600 to 1,700 pages, which consist of all the history in regard to the reuse of the hospital, as far as meetings, public meetings, things of that nature. Maps, contracts, agreements, aerial photographs, a whole number of different topics is within that 1,700 pages. But the first 60 to 70 pages is the actual generic environmental impact study. So that's why I'm here tonight, is just basically to talk about that study and how everyone in the city of Utica, South Utica, has the ability to review the document and then either make a written comment, and I believe it's by April 4th, right, Brian? Because it's 60 days?
Yes.
I believe it's a written...
No, I believe it's May 4th.
May 4th?
May 4th.
Okay, you have till May 4th to make a written comment, or you can attend the public meeting on March 20th. Okay, so I went through and I printed out the actual 60 pages of the study, and I just want to give you the Cliff Note version, so to speak, instead of getting into the weeds with all the details and all that stuff. So As I mentioned earlier, there's been 2 public meetings in which everyone in the community has had the chance to make a comment as far as what they would like to see the reuse of that property be. They've taken all that public information and the consultants, the city, MVHS, has actually determined as far as what the 4 or 5 best alternatives would be for that property, and you've seen them. You know, there's actually 5. There's the no-build alternative, the single-family houses alternative, townhouses alternative, residential reuse, or as they call it, the historical reuse of the property, and multifamily alternative. And even though those are the 5 alternatives, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, that when the RFP goes out to the developer community, they could even come up with their own version of a completely commercial site. Okay, because basically when the RFP goes out, then they have the chance to actually, you know, tell as far as how they would like to see that property actually reused. And based on the way the zoning is right now, and I always use this as a fun statement, and you know, if it's going to be commercial, there could be a water park in that area, because it's the way it's zoned. So so basically, it's important for the community to actually get involved and, you know, voice your opinion as far as how you think that property should be reused. Even though there's 5 alternatives on the books at this point in time. But as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that there might be another reuse, that a developer comes in and says, I want to put a commercial alternative in this site and not go with housing. So,
Excuse me, an RFP means request for proposals?
yes. Yes, it does.
Not everybody speaks City Hall.
Yeah. Is this Tim?
Yes, it
Hi,
is.
Tim, how are you?
I'm fine, how are you?
Good. Thank you for finding that for me.
I'll help you along, I have a couple other questions.
Okay. So, so with the single-family house alternative, the townhouse alternative, and the multifamily alternative, that would require complete demolition of the site. Okay, and the last planning board meeting which I attended, in which the planning board determined that this environmental impact study was, quote, complete, the consultant said that the demolition cost would be in the neighborhood of $25 million. I'm not sure as far as how they break that, how they came up with that figure. I'm not sure how they do that. But I'd like to know as far as how they came up with that number. And I'd like to know as far as, is that demolition cost being utilized by a vendor that's local, or is it someone that is not local? Because we do have demolition companies in Oneida County, Herkimer County, that maybe the bid might be lower. I don't know. I'm just speculating at this point. So with the fact that with those 3 alternatives, the actual property needs to be demolished, that hosts a whole array of different other questions. The historical reuse, they're gonna adapt or refurbish some of the buildings that are on the site itself. There's phase 1 and phase 2 of the historic reuse, and when it's all said and done, there's about 252 apartments that are associated with that aspect. And Brian, you can correct me if that number's wrong too. So for all the people that surround the medical center, I mean, you know, it's up to you. If you, do you feel comfortable with having 252 apartments in your backyard or front yard, depending as far as where you may be? That's a question that you have to ask yourselves, and you have to, if you don't feel that's the appropriate method, then you have to voice your opinion. And hopefully, with enough community input, our city leaders and our planning board will determine as far as what's best for the community. So, as I mentioned previously, there's a whole array of different questions that come about based on this study. And one of the questions that I have is, what deems the property historic? You know, what is it? Is it SHPO that deems the property historic? How is that all? How does that come about? Because my question is that I have lived in my home for over 30 years, and there's been a lot of renovation done to that property. The original hospital, if you look at the aerial photographs, it was just one small hospital and maybe the convent. And then over the years, they've added wings and added third and fourth floors to the back of the property. They added the parking garage. So there's been many new construction aspects to the property, and you know, is based on those changes to the actual hospital itself, the original hospital, does that affect the historic nature of that property? I don't know. Maybe someone can answer that question. The other thing is that when Sister Rose Vincent decided to take down the great lawn, okay, in the front, removing all those old oak trees, and there was even a stone home that was on Genesee Street where the priest lived in. They removed that to put in parking lots in the front of the hospital. I mean, were those oak trees and was that stone home considered historic? And if they were, then the planning board and the United County Historic Society, did they voice an opinion to, you know, reject that? But that still happened. It still took place. So, in my opinion, over the years, there's been some things that are deemed historic that have been removed. So, would the removal of the medical center for one of the demolition alternatives affect the historic nature of that site? I don't know. Someone's got to tell us that, in my opinion. So, so basically, the generic environmental impact study. And let me get my glasses so I can read this because the print's small. It consists of categories: community character, permanent impacts on historic resources, impacts on traffic, parking and pedestrians, impact on public services and community plans, impacts on land and zoning, impacts from construction on human health, including asbestos abatement and potential to encounter hazardous materials, permanent impacts on aesthetic resources, impacts of the extension of the energy transmission or supply system for greater than 50 single-family homes, impacts on stormwater and drainage, impacts on noise, odor, and light, a summary of potential impacts and associated mitigation measures as acceptable as provided within the document. Those are the categories that basically this document actually talks about for all 4 cases. And like I say, if you were having insomnia one night and you want to find something to put you to sleep real fast, boy, this is it. Okay? So, so a couple things that I thought were interesting was that when it comes to the historic reuse of the property, it states in the document numerous times, and of course it's going to, because with all the different categories I just read, some of the verbiage is repetitious. But one thing that I found enlightening is that there's a statement that says, according to SHPO, the campus is eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places as described in section 3.3.1 of the draft generic environmental impact study. Additionally, the campus is designated local. The campus is a designated local historic reuse and is located in the city of Utica Scenic and Historic Preservation Overlay District. So, I guess the key word is eligible. Okay, because it says that throughout the study when it comes to the reuse of the property. So, is it just eligible or is it historic? I don't know. I mean, that's a question I'd like to know. And for the most part, as a general statement, throughout the document, it states that with all those categories that I read to you, that it compares each alternative with the hospital when before it actually closed. And it states that basically all these alternatives would have less impact on all the categories than when the hospital was in full service. Okay, so that statement runs throughout the entire document, and which would be common sense. I mean, a hospital that is operating at full capacity with whether it's traffic, whether it's energy, whatever the scope may be, and then you convert that over to one of the 4 categories, just be common sense that the amount of energy use, the amount of traffic, the amount of pedestrian use, things of that nature would be less than when that facility was in full operation. Just makes sense. So that's one of the common themes that actually take place throughout the document also.
I just want to ask one question. Did you want people to ask you any questions on what you've talked about so far, or do you just want to go through it and then have people ask you questions afterwards?
No, I mean, if anybody has any questions, they
Just
can
if you
ask
guys do, be sure to ask us. Now's a good time, because we also have Brian Thomas here too, so.
Why don't you finish?
Okay. No, we're gonna
Go on.
go ahead.
Okay. So, say I'm flipping through these pages to see if there's anything that else sticks out in my mind. So the other thing that I want to, I mentioned this earlier, is that one of the important aspects of the lease of the property is of course, the agreements that our neighborhood corporation signed in 1999 with the medical center. And that's the conservation easement and the settlement agreement. And these agreements came about as a result of the medical center wanting to expand. And we as neighbors wanted to have a permanent boundary between the medical center and the neighborhood. And in my opinion, it's not just the private property owners that have a big stake in this, but the medical center has a big stake in this also. When I say medical center, I mean MVHS. Because back in the early 80s, they campaigned to buy multiple houses on Lower Valentine Bray that were adjacent to the medical center. So currently, MVHS owns 11 properties adjacent on Lower Valentine Bray, because in the early 80s, Sister Rose Vincent wanted to build a business administrative building on Valentine Bray. Now, they sent Chris Connors out to talk to the private property owners to actually buy their properties, and a few of the private property owners wouldn't go for it because they lowballed them. So basically, because there was a few property owners that said no way, that spoiled their deal. And in addition, those houses are zoned residential, and and when the neighborhood found out that they wanted to put a business administrative building on Lower Valentine Bray, we fought that and said we're not going to change the zoning on that. And plus, they couldn't build it anyway because they didn't have all the property they wanted. So when they wanted to expand in the late 90s, that's when the neighborhood formed a corporation and we created these documents. And these documents are binding, and there's successor clauses in the agreements that states that no matter who the hospital sells the property to, these agreements are binding. And that's why you see that in all the concepts for the four alternatives that were at the public meetings, or in the reuse master plan, okay, you'll see that the actual reuse is within the conservation easement. So when the RFPs are finally written up by the city, MVHS, and the consultants, and distributed to the developer community, then the environmental impact study, plus all the documentation, which is within this 1,700 pages, which consists of the actual public meetings, maps, our legal documents, even your signature pages from when you attended the meetings are within that 1,700 pages, and those developers will be looking at that information. In addition to any further comments or that may be written or spoke at the March 20th meeting or any subsequent meetings. So, as I stated previously, written comments can be sent to the city by May 4th, and you can also attend the May 20th meeting, March 20th meeting to discuss the impact study. So, going onto the City of Utica website and just looking at the first, 60 pages, it's not that hard. I did it. If I can do it, anybody can do it. So, if you have any concerns, then take an hour or 2 hours, look at the dialogue, and then form your own conclusion. And then, if you feel it's warranted, make a public comment or come to the meeting on March 20th.
Thank you. Do anyone have any questions for Don?
I have a question.
Go ahead, John.
This is a question for you and also for Brian Thomas and for anyone else, like our councilman who just walked in the room, who has knowledge of it. There have been a number of committees that have been active in this process. The previous city administration, which changed about a year ago, I guess, had a committee. And then there are several other committees that have got mentioned from time to time. Whoever presented the maps and the material at the public hearings. So my question is, who pulls the trigger that says, this is how it's going to be?
I'll come up here.
Okay, that's great. I was hoping I could.
It worked.
So how does the final decision get made? After everybody looks at the website and writes their comments and goes to meetings and says what they think, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At some point, some entity makes a decision that this is what's going to be done. I'm wondering who or what is that entity?
The intent is that the RFP, the request for proposals, that MVHS will eventually put out as soon as the secret process is concluded, will include all 4 development scenarios that Don discussed as potential alternatives for redevelopment of the campus. And it'll be up to the developers that respond to that request for proposals with an actual proposal that will tell us what they're looking to build. And it could be one of those 4. It could be
No.
something completely different
Yeah.
than those 4. It could be a combination of pieces of those 4.
But,
Or it could be completely commercial too, right?
Yeah, that's what I mentioned.
Yeah.
but after,
It's unlikely that it would be something totally commercial. The consultant team did a market study that didn't find retail or office as a viable, as there being a viable reuse potential. It really supported residential use as the proposed use, and there was market study based on that.
okay, but again, I'll repeat, after the request for proposals goes out and developers respond to those requests for proposals
Hopefully.
with either supporting or saying they'd like to do one of the 4 choices or offering a 5th choice of their own design. Who makes the decision of which request, which proposal gets implemented?
Well, the accepting of a proposal is going to ultimately end in the sale of the property. So the entity that's going to make that decision ultimately is the owner of the property, which is MVHS.
So we're going through all of this, and MVHS makes the ultimate decision.
Don't forget, MVHS has been a key partner in this process. They've paid for half of the consultant cost. They are a member of the steering committee, and they're invested in the process, in this planning process that we've been going through.
Well, they own the property, they ought to be paying for the whole thing, in my opinion.
Yeah. Should be paying taxes on it too, now that they're not
Yes.
using it anymore.
What impact does the planning board have once MVHS picks a specific proposal? Does the planning board have any impact on that?
In a couple ways, depending on the uses and the density, site plan review and approval may be necessary, and that can only go through the planning board. Depending on what the developer is proposing, if it's not in keeping with the generic environmental impact statement, well, at that point it'll be a final environmental impact statement. If the impacts from the proposed development exceed what are in the EIS, then the developer would have to come back in front of the planning board to reopen the seeker process.
So, I guess what I was trying to understand was that basically MVHS does, even though they pick a certain project, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be approved by the planning board. Am I correct in that statement?
Yes.
So basically, you know, there could be like, hopefully 10 proposals that come through.
Hopefully
and-
more than one.
Yes. And then, you know, if by some chance that MVHS likes a certain proposal, that's going to go through the chain and eventually get to the planning board, and then the planning board's going to decide as far as whether it's a go or a no.
But does the planning board have the authority or the power to say, this is it, or is that a prerogative of the Common Council?
No, nobody's choosing one scenario and putting that out as the RFP. The intent was to provide alternative scenarios the development community could view as potential and select from.
But eventually, somebody's gonna say, okay, this is it.
Yes, MVHS.
And we're
So even though the planning board says, no, we don't care for that, it can still be overridden by MVHS?
No, ultimately, the developer understands they're going to have to go through a review process, an approval process with the planning board.
May I ask a question?
I don't get it. I'm sorry.
Does MVHS have a developer in mind?
No.
Okay, and how long would that take if all these proposals are going through and the hospital does not like any of the proposals? Are they looking for a developer that would develop the property according to what they want? Or will we be represented on the planning board as to what we want? Like, in other words, will they find a developer that they can sell the property to that will do what they want over maybe our objection?
Well, I think MVHS has been a partner through this process because they want what the community wants.
Okay.
They ultimately don't want to own that property long-term and have to maintain it long-term. So they do have an interest in selling it, but they wouldn't have been involved in this process with the city and the community if they weren't interested in seeing that it were developed in the best interest of the neighborhood and the community.
Okay, and here's my second question. So if the hospital is deemed a landmark, it's historic, and we can't take it down, so then the developer's hands are tied, would have to develop the building with those units, and not,
Well, and Don had a few questions, I think, about the historic nature. So let me see if I can sort of
Okay.
answer both of your questions. During this planning process, there was a consultant team that assisted the city and MVHS and worked with the steering committee on developing the plan. They consulted with the State Historic Preservation Office. Don mentioned SHPO, that's State Historic Preservation Office. They look at the architecture, they look at events that may have taken place in the buildings, the design, the importance of the campus and the buildings that make up the campus to the community and to the neighborhood. and they determined that there are a number of buildings on the campus that contribute to the historic nature of the campus, and have thus determined that it's eligible for listing on the National Register. Now, to actually be listed on the National Register takes an application process that nobody's gone through as of yet. In terms of the demolition, whether it's listed on the National Register or just considered eligible for listing on the National Register, doesn't really matter. In terms of paying for the demolition, if state or federal funds are used, then there's a review process that includes the State Historic Preservation Office. And they're unlikely to approve the demolition of what they call contributing structures with state or federal funds. There were a few structures on the campus that were considered non-contributing. The parking garage was one, and I believe the back portions of the hospital that were added on after 1960 roughly were also considered non-contributing. So those could be demolished without any issue from the State Historic Preservation Office. Now, Don mentioned the priest's house on the corner of, I believe, Valentine Bray and Genesee, and the Great Lawn, which were removed several years ago. Those were done, I believe, with hospital money or private money. Private money doesn't require the review of the State Historic Preservation Office before demolition is done. So those were demolished without the review, I believe, of the State Historic Preservation Office. Now, the campus is, as Don mentioned, also located in the city's Scenic and Historic Preservation District, and there's a board that reviews projects that alter the exterior of properties within the Scenic and Historic District, and that review would be required.
So that would take a longer period of time, and also, if it's deemed historic, the hospital would have no other choice. If a developer came in, the hospital would have to stay there, and they would have to make those units, right? The condo units, or...
No, again, private money is, if a developer comes in and
Yeah.
says, I'm going to use my own money and demolish the hospital, which the State Historic Preservation Office considers a contributing structure,
Okay.
it can be done, assuming they get the approval of the local Scenic and Historic Commission. If they're going to use state or federal funds through grants, then it's not likely going to be allowed.
If they use state and federal funds, they can do it in low-income housing, right? That's what,
Ask your question again?
if they use state and federal funding, they can throw in low-income housing projects.
The RFP, the request for proposals that we're going to put out, will ask for the developer for a financial pro forma for their project. Basically, what's called the sources and uses. What are their sources of funding, and what do they intend to use it for? If they indicate a low-income housing tax credit, which is federal funds for the purpose of developing affordable housing, it's not going to go very far. I can tell you MVHS already had a proposal from an affordable housing developer that Bob Schofield asked me to meet with, and I basically let him know your proposal is going nowhere in terms of further review.
Excuse me, where can I find a picture of these plans? I have a short memory here, and probably a lot of people do. Are there any pictures or any renderings of these four plans?
cityofutica.com. Go all the way to the bottom of the page. Under Connect with Utica, there's a St. E's link. Click on that, and it'll take you to the whole page. You'll have every public document that's been developed through this planning process.
That's the 1,700 pages I was talking about.
But it also has the pictures of the four
Yes, it does.
scenarios.
Yes, it does.
Don, first of all, I want to thank your group for having that conservation, because a lot of us don't understand